everyone, and welcome back to the second part of my discussion with Dr. Thomas Bade. Today we continue to talk about aviation sustainability as well as social distancing and aviation safety. On the point of environmental sustainability, I'm also thinking what role new technologies, or maybe not necessarily even new, but definitely now being more widely adopted and recognized and appreciated, for example, like working from home, which made a lot of companies realize that it can be both productive and possible, really. People are still able to generate the value even while working remotely. And then how that's gonna tie in what you already said about change in passenger behavior, slightly less consumable and more towards environmental awareness as well, and how it will contribute to, for example, reshaping of the domestic travel market itself. And then effectively what it will mean for the economic sustainability within the aviation industry as well.
Yeah, I think that's a key question. And when we talk about business travel, we all know the importance of business travel to aviation. Of course, it's fundamentally important to the economic sustainability of the airline market. What this COVID-19 situation has demonstrated, though, as you say, is that working from home and communicating as we are now on Zoom, Microsoft Teams and so on can be achieved, and life carries on and business continues. So whether that means that we will see a suppression of business travel by air following this pandemic, I think it's quite possible, and I'm sure it's something that the airlines, operators and service providers are very, very aware of, and I think it is a threat. Whether that will cause and push airlines to be quite innovative in their business models and their service provision, possibly, I don't know. We've already seen some sort of tentative examples of that. I remember, I think either a few months ago, maybe even a year ago, KLM made the news by being the first airline to sort of actively promote not flying. And they ran a campaign saying that in some cases it may not be necessary to fly, which is obviously fairly counterintuitive for an airline to run that as a marketing campaign. But it sort of highlighted the fact that they may be shifting more towards the sort of provision of experiences and travel experiences rather than as a provider of travel itself. So we might see an evolution of the traditional airline business model potentially, which I think is quite an interesting concept. So it's possible that we will see airlines continue and operators continue, but it might be that model is slightly different or diversified from what it was prior to this current situation.
And I also think that, as you mentioned, a big question mark is a really prevailing issue at the moment. And another demand factor really that comes to my mind in this context would be passenger regaining confidence in traveling in general.
Yeah.
And I think that brings us to another topic for today's discussion, because what is directly gonna drive that and influence passenger confidence would be the social distancing, so something which is at the moment widely discussed across all of the industry, and how we can effectively provide the safety measures that will make passengers feel like, okay, we can go back to traveling. So one part is the technology or the real need and necessity to travel in terms of business context, but also leisure. And then another will be the most short term. When we resume the operations, how can we create effectively the environment which is promoting safety, which also makes necessary provisions for the physical distancing, while also keeping it viable, practical, and coherent. I think this is a big issue as well. So I would be really interested to get to know your views on this one as well.
Of course, yeah, I think it's clearly extremely relevant in the current context. I think it's interesting. A few weeks ago, I don't think I've ever used the term social distancing, but now it's a term that everyone is familiar with, and it's the new normal. So that's exactly the case. I think in an air transport context, that is where the focus will be. We've seen already some suggestions around how that would be implemented. There was an early suggestion around keeping the middle seat free, for example, on flights to try and promote social distancing. I personally am of the view that that is not a sustainable decision. That would effectively mean aircraft flying with a maximum of 66% capacity, and we know that that is not sustainable in terms of load factors at all. So I can't see that being a longer term solution. I think certainly Michael O'Leary at Ryanair has been quite vocal in his opposition of that approach. I think it's more likely that what you will see will be changes to operating practices. So I mentioned the sort of no queuing on aircraft in the aisle. I think things like that will become more common. In terms of in the airport environment, again, I think social distancing will be extremely difficult to enforce in the traditional sense, in the sense of keeping people 2 meters apart at all time. I think in reality that's possibly not hugely realistic. I know John Holland-Kay at Heathrow again has said it will be very, very difficult or impossible to ensure that in a way that's operationally and economically viable in an airport. But I think that there are things that can be done which actually don't rely on hugely innovative technology. In some cases, I think in many cases, the technology already exists. It's just that it may require significant sort of changes to existing operating practices. But actually, these changes could yield both benefits from a sort of health and safety perspective, but also have passenger experience and commercial benefits. So one of the examples would be something like virtual queuing. So it could be a situation where passengers would reserve or even possibly even pay for a particular time slot. So they could say when they wanted to check in their luggage and or go through security. And when your time slot came as a passenger, you would have a notification to say that was your time to check in and to go through security. So from a sort of social distancing perspective, such a scheme would hopefully alleviate the buildup of queues, for example. So you would smooth out your peaks, so you didn't have everyone arriving at exactly the same time. So from that perspective, reducing queues is great from a sort of health perspective, but it's also a passenger experience benefit. And people generally don't like standing in long queues for a long time. So, and by association, that potentially frees up time for additional dwell time within the terminal. So if people are not standing in queues and they're confident that they will get through security at their time, they would be able to spend more time in coffee shops or enjoying the shops and duty free within an airport, which could have quite important commercial benefits for the airport itself. So I think if we were able to identify the sort of achievable goals and changes, but ones that also have sort of additional or supplementary benefits, I think that's where the greatest potential lies. I mean, we've already seen examples of similar trials along similar schemes. So I know Gatwick Airport last year they trialed boarding passengers by specific seat number, which, as you might expect, was a lot quicker than the traditional boarding method. So passengers were given a notification based on where they were sitting, and they were told to board the aircraft at a specific time. And of course, it was managed in a way so it would minimise people being sort of standing in the aisle, getting stuck behind people who were sitting in rows in front of them. And it was a lot more efficient. It worked well. I think it's something that we will see. That was in a sort of trying to improve the turnaround process. But of course, that has benefits in terms of social distancing and things like that as well. So they are the sorts of areas where I think we might see an evolution in the way that airports are designed and operated.
Absolutely. And at EBEA, we have already built a couple of simulation models to also try and understand and also assess the impacts of those social distancing measures. And the conclusions were pretty much similar and very clear as well, that I think this is something that we need industry-wide in terms of clarity on guidance and sort of like a almost unified approach on how to do it in the most viable but also safe manner, which is also promoting passenger experience. And I think that what you mentioned it's exactly that. and technology will play a huge role in what you say, evolution. And I think it will be curious and interesting to see to what an extent it's gonna reshape our reality and how the airports are being operated, and how many of those, maybe the most imminent solutions, they will just become the new norm, the new reality. So that's still ahead of us, I reckon.
Yeah, I agree. I think the point that you touched on around consistency and standards is absolutely key. I think it's still fair to say that there is an inconsistency in across the sector, but also across the journey. So I think if we can strive for a more sort of consistent standard on these sorts of changes and interventions around social distancing and so on, I think that would go a long way to increasing consumer confidence, and also sort of demonstrating a unified approach to tackling this problem. I think the risk is that in a fragmented sort of airport sector, that everyone goes off and does their own thing, and some providers are doing this and other providers are doing that, and in a sort of uncoordinated way. I think as far as possible, it's really important now, so more than ever, that as an industry we are able to work collectively and collaboratively towards clear shared goals in a way that is consistent and makes sense, both from a sort of economic and operational perspective, but also one that from a passenger and user perspective builds confidence, and they can be safe in the knowledge that they are being taken care of, and their experience is not suffering too much. So I think that issue of consistency and standards is absolutely fundamental.
Weirdly enough, it almost seems like a perfect opportunity to sort of take a step back, since everything has been brought to a standstill already anyway, and like you said, in a collective manner, think on the new shape, and also building the industry even stronger. So not only going through this recovery process, but effectively improving on so many levels, and again thinking in a wider context of the seamless travel and passenger experiences.
Yeah, I agree. I think if there's any sort of silver lining to be taken from what is otherwise a really horrendous situation, I think disruptions like this do present the opportunity to reassess and to perhaps make changes that otherwise would not have been considered otherwise. I think inevitably in something like in aviation and in other sectors, inevitably change is often quite incremental and quite slow. Of course, in something like aviation, it has to be. Obviously it's a highly regulated industry, but changes like this and disruptions like this present opportunities, I think. So yeah, like you say, this might be the point at which there is a natural opportunity to reassess the norm and the status quo, and it might be that there are some things that we keep, but there might be a realization that actually just because we've been doing like this, this is how things have always been, doesn't necessarily mean that that's the best way of doing them. So maybe there is an opportunity to reassess processes across the journey.
Thomas, thank you very much for sharing with us your views and giving us all those valuable insights. Now, I think in a traditional way, I'm gonna put you in the spotlight again and ask for your key highlights and takeaways from our today's discussion. Just a key highlights and takeaways from our today's discussion.
Yeah, so you certainly have put me on the spot there. I think in terms of highlights and takeaways, certainly in terms of our work in Dartec, I think it is quite clear that there is great potential for disruptive digital technologies to play a significant role in reshaping the future of air transport, particularly around things like the passenger experience. So I talked about extended reality and VR technologies. that is the tip of the iceberg, I think. So there is huge potential there to really reshape what is possible in air transport. I think in terms of what we've just talked about and COVID-19, I think there will be change. I think being able to remain flexible and resilient as an industry will be more important than ever. Of course, our traditional means of forecasting using past data is now kind of irrelevant given what's happened. It's all about sort of real-time forecasting and the here and now, I think, which is going to be really important. So that element will be absolutely key. And I think, as we just said at the end, I think now this is the point where we can reassess, work together to try and get the aviation industry running again post COVID-19. But more than ever, it's now extremely important that as an industry we are able to collaborate and work collectively, and that means both industry and also academia as well. And we certainly want to play a role in that at Cranfield.
Thank you very much again for joining us today. It has been a great pleasure to talk to you, Thomas.
No problem at all. It's been a pleasure to speak with you, Hubert.
And thank you all for listening. We will be back next week.